Hello students. In today's session, we have with us Dr. Anand Prakash sir, retired professor from University of Delhi. Students, today we will be looking at an important topic known as African thought. Before I begin, I want to tell you that if you have any queries, please feel free to contact on the toll-free number 1-800-110-430. So, without wasting much time, let us begin. Welcome, sir.
Thank you, Inayat, and welcome viewers. And today's topic, as has been announced, is African thought. And all of you would be wondering as to what I would say about African thought and why I have brought in this specific aspect of writing or this aspect of the area that we are going to discuss. Now, African continent has been called the dark continent, mysterious continent, somebody about which nobody knows. And as if you know, these people didn't exist till the 20th century. Why was it so? Did they not have a history? Did they not have human beings? Did they not have the institution called the family, schools, any place of learning? Did they not have, you know, the way of life that would govern them, that would educate them, that would put them in some kind of a framework and make them collective, you know, part of the collectivity called the African people? All these questions become irrelevant if we think, you know, that they don't exist as people from history. So, the question that was till the early 20th century, made was the question that America doesn't have a history. Now, what does history mean? History means, you know, a kind of life that is a chain in which it operates, and that chain continues since time immemorial up to the present time, and that this chain has seen ups and downs, phases of progress and phases of decline, and that out of decline they emerged, and when there were good phases, then they were enjoying themselves. So, this is what history is called generally. But can I imagine that there is a whole continent of millions of people who doesn't have a history? Now, let me tell you that this idea existed till the middle of the 20th century, that these people were not civilized, that they had no, you know, norms to abide by, that they had no, you know, value system to observe. But they have forgotten, these people who have this kind of prejudice against the African people, they forget that the wealth that Europe, you know, created in the preceding 500 or so years from Elizabethan time onward in England, and even before that, that wealth was produced not by the whites, not by the Europeans. This wealth was actually created by the people from Africa. And if you must have heard, you know, that there was a slave trade at that time. People would come from the European countries, and they would, you know, use all kinds of methods, tricks, and you know, wild strategies to entangle these people, tie them up, bring them to the European markets, put them on sale, and then made them to work hard in the fields. So, if Renaissance, for instance, occurred in the 14th century onwards, and you know, if England prospered, if Germany prospered, if Spain prospered, if France prospered, it was because of this labor that came from Africa. So, slave trade continued till the 19th century, till the end of the 19th century in fact, and when enlightened people in Europe and America, they, you know, took up their cause as human beings who were equal to us. And when, you know, these people settled down in America, for instance, in Latin America and elsewhere, then people realized that they are human beings as much as us, if not more dignified, because these people suffered a lot at our hands. And if I make anybody suffer as a controlling authority, if a whole society makes a section of people suffer on the strength of you know, control, then who is to lose? Humanity is lost by the person who inflicts suffering on the other. So, I would say that Africans would be in fact more civilized because they suffered, and they quietly suffered because they were not given a voice. So, I do not want to dwell much on this. I say that Africa having no history is a prejudice that we have to get rid of. And there is a kind of bias also in our thoughts. Do you know that when I am saying something, I always show some kind of a bias. I may be conscious of it, I may not be conscious of it. This great theoretician Edward Said in the 20th century told us that we have a strange concept in our head, and this concept is us. So, when the Europeans or Americans discuss things, then they always say us, they always say we. And when they talk about people outside themselves, outside their country, then they would call them they. So, they and us. Now, this gap between they and us, other people are they and we are us. This is a strange kind of a gap. It does not make any sense, because if you understand that all of us are members of the world system which constitutes of human beings, then all of us are us. Whether one is born in Japan or in India or in Africa or in Europe or in America, then all of us are human beings and therefore us. But they will always create a gap between they and us. And this was Edward Said very clearly and convincingly established this fact, that this idea of me and the other person, actually he coined this word called othering. You make somebody other. So, when you make somebody other, then it becomes othering. So, this othering of the Europeans in the context of Africa, it is that which did a great deal of cultural harm, ideological harm to the African people. So, this is the background against which I today say that there is something called African thought, thought that is rooted in the reality in the life of Africa, and that this thought is to be understood in its totality. This thought is to be seen as a kind of dynamic entity in human behavior. So, without thought, you can't move, you can't strategize, you can't plan, you cannot meet somebody else. Without thought, you can't communicate with anyone. Therefore, thought is very important, and this thought has to be, in our case, in today's context, when we are discussing African thought, has to tell us as to what exactly Africa means to us. Us means all of us being members of the humanity that inhabits this planet. And therefore, I say that African thought as thought was there earlier. They had a history, they had a family, they had a system, they had some kind of governance. They lived in the lap of nature, but there also they organized themselves. They had what is called a form of entertainment all the time. And in 20th century, I am horrified to say, till the 20th century, people say that they have no literature. But when you go there, when you talk to people there, when you meet the educated ones there, when you communicate with their leaders, some of the masters, the husbands, the wives, the children, then you realize that they can be as happy in their own way as we can be happy in our own way. Now, I am just at random referring to the concept, because we have this lecture series called World Literature, and we have already had some lectures on general lectures on world literature, and we will be taking up this week itself prose, fiction and poetry this or the next week, and there we will talk about how literature becomes important for them in the 20th century. I would give some credit for this to the Second World War ending in the 1940s. After that, a large number of countries which were earlier colonized, India was a colony in the 1940s. In 1947, it became free, to be precise. And if India was colonized, if China was colonized, if all the other countries excepting a few were colonized, if the entire continent of Africa was colonized, if in fact America was colonized, I hope all of us understand this, that Britishers, Germans, French, it is they who migrated from their respective countries to America and colonized it. So, if America is colonized, then this colonization starts coming to an end earlier than the First World War in the 19th century itself, because of the movements. But then in a big way, the clutches of colonization were loosened somewhat in the wake of the ending of the Second World War, and after that people became free. India became free, and some of the African countries also had movements of freedom, and this freedom told them, and this freedom also told the enlightened people elsewhere. For instance, there were English scholars There were American scholars, there were French scholars who would, you know, be more sensitive than their masters, who would come there, who would, you know, who would be educated, who would be cultured, who would have certain values, who would try to mix up with these people, and they would then realize that they had a very evolved system of storytelling. What is storytelling? Storytelling means that I have a narrative in my mind. I have, you know, a kind of sequence in my mind. There are incidents which lead to others, and finally those incidents are resolved. Those problems that are raised in the stories, they're resolved at the end. So if you have some kind of a problem, that problem involves people. People then find answers to the problem and they resolve. Now this becomes a kind of a sequence, and this sequence is a story. Now, did Africa have this kind of a narrative? This question, you know, was disturbed the minds of people who visited Africa in the 20th century, and they knew that they came to know that Africa had a very evolved system of storytelling. And in fact, in the evening, children, parents, grandparents, all of them would sit, and the grandparents would tell, you know, tales to the audience, to the listeners there. What would those stories be like? Those stories would be about animals, let's say. So there is a strong animal and there is a weak animal. There is a big animal and there is a small animal, and these animals talk. And when they talk, then of course they talk in a language that Africans themselves would be speaking. So children would be very greatly entertained by the story. And you know, the same story told, you know, by a grandparent yesterday, for instance, would be retold today, would be retold the next time. And people knew that this was a story in the tribe that would be told, but they would listen to them. Why? Why would they listen to the same story again and again? And why would they be entertained by the same story again and again? You ask this question, and I think we have the answer in India, because in India we have a very rich tradition of storytelling. We have grandparents here who in the evening regale the children, telling them stories, and there are just 10-15 stories that are popular in a community and a society, and those stories are told again and again. In India, it is just the case. I hope you talk to your grandmother, you talk to your great grandmother if she is there, and then they will tell you the same story, but that story keeps you interested, in fact completely absorbed. Why? Ask this question from yourself, and you will realize that the same story that was told yesterday, when it is retold today, certain elements have been added to it. Maybe there is a different audience, maybe there is a new child there, maybe the grandparent has changed. Yesterday it was grandmother from one side, and then it became like in India, it became a dadi from dadi, a nani, and because there is a different individual who is telling the story, that individual would bring in one's own style. And in the meantime, as between yesterday and today, some incident has taken place in the village, in the community, that will create a sense, you know, of presence in the story itself. So this is the element, you know, that is creative in the storytelling. And people realize that in Africa, this kind of a story would be retold and people would be happy. And sometime they might start thinking of giving, you know, a sense of character, not just to animals, but to human beings. In fact, when animals are shown as in the story, are told in the story as behaving, talking, then it's human beings who are behaving and talking, because animals don't talk, animals don't have a language. So if in language an animal says something, that actually is somebody, some human being who is saying that indirectly in the imagination. And if you have the problem as a listener, as an audience, to communicate with an animal in your imagination, do you know what happens? At that point of time, you are doing a kind of translation in your own mind. The animal says something to another animal, and you are, you know, you are grasping the meaning of that animal's speech in your mind. You are processing it, and you and your fellow listener are also listening to it, and later on maybe you will tell. So imagine, in fact, the inspiration energizes the mind more when you are interpreting the animal's speech, the animal's problems. So that way the African imagination will be activated, and that activation, you know, will give rise to some kind of a growth in language. So this is a long tradition. One can't say this was there in the 20th century in Africa. It must have been there in the 19th century, must have been before that. The tales that were told had a very old history. And if if somebody has the patience and the diligence to go around and collect these tales, and collect these tales from different tribes, and then studies those tales in their variety, in their variation, in their difference, then a whole wealth of culture, a whole wealth of norms and morality that will be available to us. So, which means that if we don't create history, the history is scattered all around. So, scholars create the sense of history. These scholars appear in Africa in the 20th century. So, they will now tell us as to how they lived, how those tales were imagined by certain people. So, this is the kind of thing. The other problem that Africa has and has had for a long time is the lack of communication between different tribes. They speak many languages. They come from one region or another, and their social system and their legal system would be different in each case. And if people now have started going into the organizing kind of principles of the regions, and then they understand that they had a system, and that system now that can be linguistically created in Africa also. Now, there is a problem regarding African thought. I'll now take some examples from the books that have been written on Africa. There was a problem. That problem was that they didn't have a written language. They didn't have a written script. They might have certain symbols. Those symbols had to be collected, but the written script was not there because writing was not there. But one should not be unnecessarily bothered about the written script, because till the printing press comes into being in Europe, and that happens, I think, in the latter part of the second millennium. I think it around 13 or 14th centuries, this thing comes into being, the printing press, the Caxton press, for instance. And till that time, the written word was not important. So, there were mythical tales. In India also, there was a script, very old script, so older than perhaps anywhere else in the world. But then these are only instances of some countries having the script, and some people not having the script. So, the written script in the case of Africa came very late, and in fact, it came it might have been given by the colonizers to them. That they started giving them the alphabets, the Roman alphabets that we use today, and Roman script, and then the sound patterns of the African words, they were captured through another script, and later on people realized that they were talking in English, and the colonizers had opened English schools, and there is a whole account about this by this great literary theorist called Ngugi. Must have heard the name. It starts with Ngugi. So, it is Ngugi. And Ngugi tells us in his autobiographical account that he started going to a school where English was taught, and he had not heard of English any time in his life earlier. He was talking in his own language at home, and it was a kind of violence to him. It was a kind of violence to all the children in the community that they were being taught English, because they didn't know what English was. And in fact, the violence also took sometimes the physical form, says Ngugi. The physical form was that the child would not be allowed to speak anything in the school, and if he spoke, then he would be, somebody would report about it to the headmaster or the principal. Then this boy will be caned, and sometimes people would hide that they spoke their own language in the school. And if that happened, and I would in fact ask this, did it not happen in India also, in Delhi schools where English is the medium, that children are not allowed to speak their own language in the school? Is that the case or no?
Indeed, sir. This is a very important point, the idea of the linguistic aspect which gets highlighted when we are looking at the colonial aspect. In fact, while you were discussing about the African thought, I happen to remember an essay written by one of the African writers, and the African critics were very well divided on the basis that should even the writings be written in the African language, should they prefer that, or should they be written in the English language, the very English language which was used as a medium, or the English people or the British or the dominant class who try to suppress the African classes. So, sir, yes, and I also happen to remember and recall one more important incident when you were talking about the idea of the other. In fact, the othering is there, and the dichotomies which have been very well established echo even till today. And yes, sir, I hence agree that caning is taking place even today, and asserting. So there is a sense of people are unable to understand that everything needs to be balanced well on the scale, because if you do not, this is a world of globalization. So should in English be encouraged, or should it not be encouraged? And that is why if we go back to the Indian education system.
Tell me about your experience in the Indian schools, where you must have been studying in the English medium school.
Yes, sir.
So were you allowed to speak in Hindi or another language?
So I have studied in a boarding school known as Mayo College Girls School, which was established by the Mayo College was established by Lord Mayo, and then came the Mayo College. And since the Christian aspect gets immediately related to it, speaking in Hindi was definitely questionable.
Were you punished sometimes as a student?
Yes, definitely. We were punished. We were encouraged to speak and use the medium of English language.
Isn't that violence to the child's imagination, to the child's mind?
Definitely, sir, it is.
The child feels guilty that one can't speak English properly?
Yes, sir. But perhaps I think that is how things have been introduced, to use the medium of English language for the betterment, because now why is English considered to be better than others, and why does
this is the question I'm raising.
Yes, so why is it considered heavier than others? In my personal view, because it's the world of globalization, and perhaps this is the best medium to communicate with the outer world.
In order to become globalized,
yes, sir,
you are taught English forcibly.
Sir.
And if you don't learn it, then violence is used against you.
Definitely, sir. Violence, not
like fine.
Yes, sir, like fine. You are scolded in the school. You are questioned that you are made to speak out in the public. Why are you not speaking in the?
As a child of 6 years, don't you feel guilty that you don't know English?
Initially, when I went, I came from a small town, and when I entered my school, I did not know English at all, sir. And in fact, I happen to remember an incident where I would write the words on my hand because there was so much pressure that the teacher would perhaps embarrass me in the public that you're not speaking in English.
This is the point I'm making, Inayat.
Yes, sir.
We are one is doing violence to the child who doesn't know about globalization and all those things.
Yes, sir,
the child is supposed to be put into an order, and if this child flouts the order, then the child is punished.
Yes,
and when one goes back home and talks to one grandmother,
definitely,
then the child doesn't know which language to use.
And when you go back to your home, you are introduced, like you said, to the idea of storytelling, which is again we go back to the whole idea of oral tradition. And here we are encouraged to engage in all that is written in English. Even the books today, of course, come in English. So definitely, sir.
So in this part of the lecture, we have discussed the aspect of Africa attaining some kind of an identity, sometimes through force, sometimes through colonization. And in fact, I would suggest that it's not the force of colonization, it's also the dignity with which people start asserting themselves against colonization. And that's how they get their identity. And then it's not the English thought, the European thought, of the whatever thought, it is the African thought. Now, Africa would now communicate in its own language, or in the language that they have learned from others, its own experiences. So the typical African experiences, the specific cultures that they have, they will be now articulated in a better manner and through literature. So this is what we have discussed in the first part of the lecture. In the second part, we will be taking up certain views and ideas from African thinkers, writers, and then we will try to elaborate this point further. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Students, we will be returning with our next session, where we will be continuing ahead with the very idea of African thought and its various views that several authors and critics have spoken about. Till then, thank you. Hello students, let us continue where we left. We were talking about African thought by Dr. Anand Prakash. So let us begin.
Thanks Anayat, and viewers, now in this second half of the discussion we will be taking up certain ideas from African writing, and this writing is theoretical writing. This writing is in the mode of statement, and let's consider a few statements to know as to what exactly African thought is. Generally, I said in the first part of the lecture that the African thought is that which is rooted in the African experience, and the African experience is not merely social experience or individual experience, it is also legal experience, it's political experience, and it has some reference to history. So let's take this quotation from Chinua Achebe, a great fiction writer from Africa, and he wrote in English, and he also was a part of the academy in the Western universities, but since he was from Africa and he knew Africa in and out, therefore he would let the world know as to how African life exists, and in what form, what their responses are, what their problems are, and how they invent certain strategies to sort out those problems. Now I take this sentence from him and then I will talk about it. He says, and I quote, "I would be perfectly satisfied if my work, particularly when I speak of the past, was to teach my readers." He is supposed to teach his readers, at least my compatriots. He is talking not merely to the people outside, to the English speaking people, but to his own people, that their past, with all its imperfections, was not a long dark night for society from which the Europeans delivered them. It's a wrong notion of the Europeans, that they think that they took English there, that they took some belief systems there, Christianity there, and it is because of that that Africa was civilized. He says that's not the case. These people came there, and they in fact they had their own ways to curb their freedoms, to curb their ways of life, and yet these people were able to, with their own sense of past, finally circumvent the problems and came back into their own. So this is the first thing that is asserting, that Africa is a distinct political social identity on the world map, and they should be known as Africans. They can't be known as this or that person, English speaking or this speaking or that speaking. They are Africans. The African geography, the African history, the African culture, the African way of life, it is that which is there to define them. Then he talks about, I touched upon this idea in general, but he specifies this. He says, short stories gave us a convenient bridge from oral to written literature. So it was all oral literature in the past, that they had no language of their own evolved as in the sense in which European languages would be evolved. But then the short stories came, they make them talk further, they made them talk to larger audiences, and then since they are now had a language, English, so they started also presenting those folk tales, those stories into English, and that started becoming written literature. So from the oral to writing, that is what the bridge that he is talking about. The third thing that he says is, in the 1980s, as late as that, we are talking of less than 40 years. In the 1980s, the early hopes of Africa, which Nkrumah's Ghana had launched in 1957, had been throttled everywhere by a grim combination of causes. Africa was subjected to a great deal of violence, and the violence would be physical and absolutely destructive. And he is talking of this Nkrumah's Ghana, and there military regimes. Military regimes means that people don't have any rights, and they can't discuss, they can't differ, they can't argue. They have to just take the orders from the authorities, and if those orders are flouted, then in most cases they are also killed. So military regimes, corrupt leadership. Military regime came from outside, corrupt leadership also came from Africa itself. So in Africa you would have sections which are rich, you would have sections which are poor, and the corrupt leadership, that also became a pawn in the hands of those who controlled the economy, and therefore that did damage and harm to the masses. Debt bondage, large countries, they give loans to the country, and then they when the wealth is created, when resources are created, then more than half is mopped up by the person who has given the debt. So that way debt becomes a kind of death trap, economically speaking, of the society, where it happens. And debt bondage to Western banks. So Western banks all came and they opened their branches in Africa, and they would give loans to people who wanted to work. And for giving loans, most of the things that Africans did in their own country, they would pass on into the hands of the people who gave them money. And then drought came because development had not taken place, and Africa, certain parts of it do not get any rain at all, and famine. So these are the things, in these conditions these people lived. So that's what Africa is. Africa is a place where suffering exists. Africa is a place where nature is not as bountiful as it is elsewhere. Africa is a place where people don't have enough time to sit back, relax and think. But anyway, let's accept that this is the kind of Africa, and this kind of Africa will create its own culture. That culture will not be the culture of Europe. That culture will not be the culture of Japan. That culture will be the culture of Africa, which somehow extends the scope of suffering into the area of language. And this point is further expanded by him. He says literary historians, those who write history through literature. Literary historians, or you write history of literature, literary historians tell us that the English novel preceded the short story by 100 years or thereabouts. He knows his English history quite well. We in India, have large English departments, and we have read all this history. We all know that a novel emerged in English literature particularly, and also in France and Germany in the 18th century, early 19th century or 18th century. Before that there was no novel. You had epics, and you had lyrics, and you had dramas, but there was no novel. Novel comes in Europe only at a time when people become powerful, when people have their own ideas to express, when ordinary middle classes, they start discussing problems of life in prose. That's when novel emerges. And then novel prospers in the 19th century, and then people start thinking of the short story. So novel precedes in Europe the short story. The opposite happened in Africa. So that can be taken as an example. The example is that the African imagination is bound more to the fables, to the folk tales, to oral literature. They speak better. They are more genuine there, and that is the African identity. So African thought, the lecture today will be substantiated with reference to more the short stories than other things. Maybe there are people who talk also to arouse the masses against some kind of an enemy, but that happens only in the middle of the 20th century and later. So before that, the literary form that exists in Africa is the form of short story. So he's talking about it. The short story came first, he says, a far more logical development, if one may presume to say so. We did not, of course, have centuries but decades to play with. This is the tragedy of Africa. Africa doesn't have any truck with literature till the 20th century. So they have only a few decades. You can count those decades in fingertips, maybe 6 decades, 7 decades. Before that, they didn't have the resources. They were merely, they were treated like cattle. As I said, in the slave trade, they would just go to other countries and they would work for them. So when these people, those who were left behind, they had somehow to survive, and in famines and in other things, how can people survive? So this kind of violence that was done to them deliberately by those who had resources on the planet Earth, that violence becomes a part of their culture, and we should recognize this. And now that we have their literature, so in fact through that literature we can relate with them also with respect to the past that they have, and that past is there enshrined in their writing now. Then after talking about Chinua Achebe himself wrote novels. I've read 1 or 2 novels by him, and he gives graphic details of the life of the family in his novels, and how some people create a sense of dissension in the society, and how they exploit that, and he talks about this corrupt culture. Then there is I read this particular account in an introduction to this contemporary African short stories. The book came out just a few years ago, and here I noted down a few names. Of course, I had heard them myself also earlier. So now you have in the 20th century, and many writers are still alive, and see their names: African writers, Sembene Osmane, Gugiwa Thiango, I referred to him. You have Tabando Leong, Nadine Gordimer, an English woman, but living in South Africa and writing in English, but writing about the African experience. Then you have Dumbeza Marachera, you have Louis Bernardo, you have Honwana, Tayeb Salih, you have Bessie Head, Chinua Achebe, I quoted him already, Amahata Aido, among others. These are the writers. There is a whole galaxy of writers today in Africa, and in this writing you see the flowering of African experience. There is a kind of crystallization of certain thoughts and ideas which are typically African, and this is what finally is going to constitute the African thought, the African response, the African explanation and self-explanation. I talk about the African experience, and I talk to you. In that case, I am giving you some kind of an idea about what Africa means to me. But when I sit back, relax, and I am quiet, then I am thinking and talking about these things myself, and there I analyze more. So what is going on inside me and what is going on outside, these things finally coalesce, and that is what African thought becomes, and that thought is now rooted in suffering, in exploitation, in some kind of a difference between one section and another, between one religion and another, between one language and another, between one society and another. Africa is not just one country, Africa is many countries. So they have their own tribes, their own languages. Now the job of the Africans is to make their languages survive, to encourage them to talk in their languages more and more. And as my friend Enayat was saying, that there is a kind of globalization there. That globalization can occur anywhere, and for that one doesn't have to kill the language of the local region. In fact, other languages of the world and the African language, they can coalesce. There can be a kind of democratic existence of all the languages, going through translation from one to the other, and this is how we can survive together. So globalization, which is based on democracy, globalization that is based on economy, on economic freedom, that is the answer, and for that we have to think of ways to achieve that answer. Then I talked of these established writers first, but now let me give you a list of other writers. Ben Okri is a young writer, then not very young now quite established. Then Jabulo Debele, Farida Karodia, Adiwal Maja Pierce, among others again, and they have now regular magazines coming up. These magazines are in English to begin with: Black Orpheus, Transition, Drum, or Kike, and these languages become now vehicles of communication from one part of Africa to another, and from Africa to other countries. So all these things are happening in Africa. They have been happening in the last 60-70 years, and there is no reason why once this process is unleashed, it should not go forward. Then this person, CRN, she says, the figure of the indomitable African mother. Now we are coming to the African thought as reflected in the African experience. What is the African mother? Is she different from mothers in Europe, mothers in India, mothers in China? Now let's see. The figure of the indomitable African mother. This woman cannot be defeated. She is indomitable. You can't dominate her. Struggling to find for her children. To this mother, African mother, children are the most important thing, and often her menfolk. She also finds for her menfolk, husband, or the husband's brothers, or the husband's father. What does she find? African mother finds for these people bare necessities, waiting fearfully for news of a missing husband or son. The husband has gone away, the son has gone away. Would they come back, or in the evening, or would they disappear? This is the fear that the African mother has faced all the time. Many mothers have not faced this fear. Like in India, I don't think that this fear is so very strong as it might be the case in Africa. So fearfully waiting for their husbands and sons and apprehending that they might not come back, recurs again and again in stories from the south, from the southern part of Africa. These stories are all the time telling us about a woman who is waiting for her sons and husbands. She is presented as a figure of the almost intolerable suffering and injustice of the system. The mother has suffered the most in the African continent, and at the same time of the superior morality and humanity. Now, this is where the crux of the argument lies, and this is what short stories capture. These people are extremely dignified. They believe in self-respect. They suffer, and they always say the right thing, the correct thing. They would not think of cruelty. They would not curse people. They are so fine as human beings that even when they don't have much, they would like to share whatever they have with others. So this kind of value system that they have, superior morality and humanity, the sheer endurance. They can suffer hunger for days on. Of black people as a whole in South Africa. South Africa exercised apartheid till the other day, and now of course some kind of democratic equality is restored, but prejudices continue, and people suffer because of this. But this is what South Africa is. This is what in fact Africa is, where women suffer more than men, where men go out and they do all kinds of things. Sometimes they might go into in the wrong directions, and women sit back and wait for them, and they look after the entire family. They rear children, they work for them, and they suffer. So this is the kind of thing that this writer is telling us. Many of the stories were veiled political allegories or documentaries. This is a new development now that they write. Therefore, they will make documentaries. Now, documentary has a multiple purpose. Documentary is to show, and in literature, in language also, you can use documentary evidence. Somebody said this, and you put it down. That becomes a document. And if more and more of the speech, more and more of the comment, more and more of the response of the people who are captured in the short story, if they are presented in language, then in fact the short story also assumes a documentary form. We have another writer called Wallace Soyinka. He's a dramatist, and just see what he says about the African thought concerning literature. Books and all forms of writing are terror to those who wish to suppress the truth. What a fine comment. You write a book, and this is a terror for those who suppress the truth. What is important for a society? Truth. They want to know what is happening. They want to know the crux of that happening. That nobody tells. So there is a person who comes forward. He says, "Okay, I'll write a book." This person writes a book, and that book becomes a terror to one who suppresses the truth. So most of the governments in Africa, most of the authorities in Africa would not encourage the writer to write, because writing means that this person will reveal the truth today or tomorrow, and truth can't be faced by the governments. Truth can't be faced by the social authorities, and therefore the task of the African writer is to tell this truth with courage in both his hands. He must take courage like that. He must have this kind of grit and determination to stick to his cause of educating the people and sharing with them the truth. Then Wallace Soyinka says the greatest threat to freedom is the absence of criticism. Writers criticize. Writer's job is to criticize. If I don't criticize, what do I say? Because I am compelled to say something. I am compelled to say because there is somebody with whom I have to differ. If this right to criticize is snatched from people, then that is the greatest threat to freedom. This is what the African writer is telling his audience, is telling the world audience at large. Wallace Soyinka confirms, and now this is interesting for us viewers, and I think you can straight away connect with this. I was just searching for some statement like this in the Google, and there this gem of a statement came to me, and let me share this with you. You might also be amused and laugh. He says, this is what the sentence is. Soyinka confirms he destroyed his green card after Trump win. This is the courage of the writer. that the writer, he said, if a person like this one can win, then I don't want this kind of a card. He is a green card holder. He is a regular author. He is a regular citizen of America. Also, Inca says he will tear up his green card if Trump wins. This is the kind of grit and determination African writer has.
Sorry, sir, I need to interrupt. We have a question from Varanasi. Please continue. Hello.
Hello, ma'am. Good afternoon, ma'am. Good afternoon, sir.
Good afternoon.
Yes, ma'am. I have a question. Can I ask?
Yes, definitely. Please go ahead.
Ma'am, I want to ask what is difference between 20th century African literature and modern contemporary literature?
Okay. May I know your name, please?
My name is Pawan.
Pawan? Is this Pawan?
Yes, ma'am. My name is Pawan.
Okay. I'll just ask your question. So, Pawan from Varanasi has a question for you. He is asking, what is the difference between 20th century African literature and the modern contemporary times of African literature?
Well, that's a good question, Pawan. As I said in my lecture in the first part, Africa starts the regular kind of writing as we recognize it only in the middle of the 20th century. So, you can discuss African writing in the context of the last 70-80 years, not more than that. And contemporary writing is writing that is taking great help from the movements in the Western societies. So, they are, for instance, I talked about the documentary writing in short stories. So, all this is coming from there. So, new writers now are, in fact, I'll explain it further also in my lecture, that the new writers now are taking to experimentation. They are more creative. They write short stories and they write novels not in the style in which Tolstoy, for instance, would write, or Gorky would write, or Dickens would write. They would now use their fantasy a great deal. So, a large number of writers, young writers, they are taking to fantasy, they are taking to the flight of imagination, and their experimentation is emboldening them, empowering them. So, it is a good question, Pawan, and please think more about it, and you can also discuss with your friends all this, that the new writing in Africa, the contemporary writing, is given more to experimentation, because people now can dare to ask relevant questions that they may not have been able to ask earlier. So, the writer is showing the path of social freedom and cultural freedom there in a big way. So, thank you, Pawan, and now then I resume the discussion.
Yes, sir.
With respect to Wole Soyinka's this act of daring, that he will not enter America now. This is a big thing, and there is a kind of consensus in Africa, that English is doing a great harm to them as a language, and in fact more than language, as a language that destroys culture in Africa. Then I first I have two authors to discuss in terms of thought, which is the African thought. First I will take up Ngugi, who is a literary critic and who is a thinker as well as a writer, creative writer. He writes, he has written plays and short stories and novels. So, I will first talk about Ngugi to you. Ngugi, I think, is still alive. I checked up and found that he is 80 years old. In fact, I had an occasion to once hear him also in India when he came and gave a lecture, and he is one of the finest thinkers at the world level. The kind of theory that he can for instance, this idea of decolonization, this is his coinage, and he did it in the 1980s. Now, what exactly is decolonization? And this is an African thought. This also, we have also learned a great deal as Indian thinkers and writers, and he is there to tell us as to what decolonization of the mind. I had heard of decolonizing, heard of colonizing a country, colonizing a society, but do you also colonize the mind? This is the point he is raising, and this is a very, very typical American African thought, that somebody can colonize our minds. What does it mean? What he means by this is that you open schools and your sources are in the West, and therefore you come here and you open schools and you dictate your own terms regarding syllabi, regarding courses, regarding teaching, regarding choice of language, regarding discipline. All these things come not from your own country. If your country has a culture of learning, if your country has a culture of debate, if your country has a culture of asking questions and differing with others, that culture should in fact be used for enriching the experience of education. Maybe this culture was there. In Africa, for instance, as I talked in general about the short story telling by the older generation to the young people, then because people would be happy and enjoying. So would education be now ensuring? Would education ensure that people will be amused, entertained and be happy? Or is education a kind of a task? You have to pass the exam, and if you fail in the exam, then you feel tragic. Is education this? Or education is that where you get knowledge, and that knowledge spreads a kind of light in your mind and spreads a light in the society, and that you feel happy that you are educated. In fact, happiness and education have not coexisted in such cases. But then the mind is colonized by the person who is talking to you as a teacher. And the Western societies, they opened schools. The Western countries, they opened schools in Africa, and they gave them ideas which may not exactly be good for their own culture, for the African culture, because these ideas came from elsewhere, and those ideas had this coercive kind of content in them. Therefore, people felt coerced. They felt in the negative sense disciplined. Not you were not inspired to think. You were in fact compelled to accept the ideas that were given through education. So this, you say, thinks Googie is the colonizing of the mind. So our job, he says, in the present context, in the context of the late 20th century and later, is to free our minds from colonization, from the ideas of the colonizers. So this is a big task, and this task is to be performed by African thought. So African thought should be that thought which becomes aware of the colonization in their history, and which also becomes aware of the necessity to resist this colonization. So this is what Googie is saying. So this is typical African thought, and all literature written in Africa is now to be governed and driven by this thought of knowing about themselves and knowing about the problems they face and the character of that problem. So this is what the African thought at the moment is. Says Googie, a writer and surgeon have something in common, a very passion for truth. Both of them want truth to get. Prescription of the correct cure is dependent on a rigorous analysis of the reality. The surgeon will fail, the person will die on the table if the surgeon doesn't know the truth, doesn't know the reality, has not worked hard and done his homework. And then he says, writers are surgeons of the heart and souls of the community. So their job is to correct your hearts and correct your soul, free your soul, make your soul healthy. How to make it? This is the question, and this is a gem of the African thought that I can think of. Then he says, work, any work, even literary creative work, writing a short story, writing a play, writing a novel, that also is work. It's not the result of an individual genius. So don't think the writer personally is doing all this, but the result of a collective effort. Why? There are so many inputs in the actual formation of an image, an idea, a line of argument, and even sometimes the formal arrangement. All that you are writing about, the person, the things, all of them are outside you, outside me as a writer. They are there in the society in which I live. So in fact, at every stage I am gaining some kind of knowledge from another person to whom I talked yesterday, to whom I talk today, and all that forms some kind of an important place in my own mind, and from there I am able to get the right kind of form. So even the formal arrangement is sometimes taken from elsewhere. You read a good story and start writing like that. And then he says, the very words we use are a product of a collective history. Words are not formed today. This word that I speak today might have been originated 500 years ago. It has a history, and this word that I am using actually would have been used by a large number of people at different points of time. Then Googie talks about the biggest weapon wielded and actually daily unleashed by imperialism against that collective defiance is the cultural bomb. So, we have thought of the atomic bomb and hydrogen bomb, and Googie is suggesting that the cultural bomb is much more harmful, that you come here, come to Africa, and you tell them that they are wrong, and the person from outside is right. So, you are destroying the morale of the people, their self-esteem, and if you do that, then you have decimated the whole society. So, this is the kind of thing which means that African writing is the writing of dignity and identity. Then I am coming to the end of the discussion. In this small time that at my disposal, I could only talk of a few things, and I will end up my this lecture with this particular quote from Frantz Fanon, another thinker, a writer and a thinker, and a psychologist, and he says, "I came into the world imbued with the will to find a meaning in things. Things are not important themselves. The meaning of things is important. My spirit filled with the desire to attain the source of the world. I should find out what is the source of this world. And then I found that I was an object in midst of other objects." This is a very horrifying situation. A human being is not an object. A human being is actually the subject. But all the people in Africa were termed objects. They were slaves, they were workers, they would be only producing things. And if I am a slave, then the other person also is a slave. So, a slave with a slave, which means that the thing is totally wrong. One should be always as a human being interacting with another human being. But if a thing is interacting with another thing, then that is the most horrifying thing. So, viewers, let me sum it up by saying that African continent came into its own as a dignified entity in the latter part of the 20th century, and after that there is no going back, and they will march forward and they will fight for their dignity. And in the case of many Africans, the biggest enemy today is the imperialist force, that force which has its roots elsewhere and which is compelling you to adopt the ways of imperialism itself. So, fight imperialism, understand it, fight through your culture, fight through your writers, fight through your political system, and become equal with the rest of humanity. Thank you.
Thank you, sir, for today's excellent session. Students, we will be having more such wonderful sessions in the upcoming future. Till then, thank you and goodbye.